welcome to the Mansplaining Podcast. And this is a podcast where two regular guys try to figure out what's going on in the world. The format of this podcast is that one of us asks the other to learn something new about something that seems to be going on in the world. And that could be something in science or history or anything in between. And this week, with a lot in the news about the federal government sending forces out to demonstrations in cities like Portland and Chicago, my question for Joe was, do those federal forces need to follow the same rules as the police, or do they operate under their own set of rules? So, please, Joe, tell us what you learned.
Okay. Hi, Mark. The short answer to your question is yes and yes. The feds operate under the same restrictions, and they have their own set of rules. And that concludes our podcast for this week. Just kidding.
Wrap that one up in
yes. So to answer your question more fully, I want to drill down on the situation in Portland, Oregon, in the past few weeks, because I think that's the case in point of federal intervention in local affairs, which I presume is why you're even asking about this in the first place.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Portland's just down the street, and I spent a lot of time there as a kid, so this kind of feels personal.
Yes, exactly. Then I want to talk specifically about the basis for some arrests made in Portland. But before I do that, Mark, you're from Oregon. We went to college together, so I know you grew up in Oregon. In the course of my research, I learned a couple of not exactly flattering tidbits about your home state. Are you ready for this?
Yeah, I'm braced and ready for this.
Okay. I was going to tell you even if you weren't ready. Oregon has a long history of white supremacy that dates back even before its founding as a state in 1859. Oregon's leaders actually banned black people from entering their territory. And there's an 1844 territorial law mandating that any black person would be, and I quote, whipped twice a year until he or she shall quit the territory. Yeah.
I'm feeling so much pride for my own state right now.
I figured as much. And that's why lots of blacks appear to have indeed quit the territory, since Oregon's racial makeup today is about 87% white and only 2% black. I bring this up because with that history, it's kind of amazing to me that Oregon has such a robust protest movement in connection with George Floyd's death and the Black Lives Matter movement.
Yeah.
Protesters have been out on the streets of Oregon literally every day since Floyd was killed by the Minneapolis police on May 25th.
Yeah, that's the part that astonishes me. Like, there have been protests across the nation, but Portland is doing it on a daily basis. Like, a while ago, they passed 50 consecutive days of demonstrations.
Yes, and that's not even the case in my own hometown of New York City, which has many more people of color. So I think it's kind of remarkable that this is happening in Portland in the first place. Okay, so here's the backstory on how things got so messed up in Portland. In June of this year, the Trump administration started deploying federal law enforcement to various places in the U.S. in response to what they were characterizing as rioting, vandalism, and the destruction of monuments, all stemming from the George Floyd protests. Mm-hmm. The first notable instance of Trump calling on the feds came on June 1st in what is the now infamous photo op in Lafayette Square when Trump ordered the U.S. Park Police and the Secret Service to clear a path for him to walk across the square. And in so doing, they violently dispersed peaceful protesters.
Mm-hmm. Also that he could very awkwardly hold a Bible up in front of the photographers.
Yes, a Bible that wasn't even his own and that he apparently held up upside down from what I read in the paper. So that's June 1st. On June 26th, Trump issued an executive order that basically said the federal government would prosecute anyone vandalizing public monuments or government property, or anyone inciting and I quote, related violence. This executive order delegated cabinet secretaries like the acting Secretary of Homeland Security, Chad Wolf, to request federal personnel from big government agencies like the Department of Defense, Department of Justice, and his own Department of Homeland Security to assist in this effort. That executive order relies heavily on Title 40, Section 1315 of the U.S. Code, which is a federal law. What? Yeah, I know this is inside baseball, but I want you to understand the underpinning for this.
Sure.
That's a federal law passed by Congress and signed by George W. Bush in 2002, soon after 9/11. And it was basically, that law was part of the establishment of the brand new Department of Homeland Security and this huge new government bureaucracy. The law established very broad powers to enforce federal laws and to protect federal employees and federal property. Now, it's important to note that Trump is not the first president to invoke this law. President Obama used this law to send what he called a surge force of a few hundred federal agents to Baltimore in 2015 after the police killing of Freddie Gray. What is new about Trump's use of the statute is that he's been using it to file criminal charges against the protesters in Portland. Trump's executive order and the federal law it was based on are the foundation for what's been happening in Portland. I don't know about you, but I was troubled that this huge bureaucracy created after 9/11 to basically defend our country from foreign terrorists is being used as justification to apprehend peaceful U.S. citizens exercising their First Amendment right to protest the government.
Trump and Fox News and Republicans in the House and the Senate have been seemingly going to a great effort to characterize these as non-peaceful protests, like to frame them as thugs, racially charged language, and vandals and criminals, and from my perspective, focusing exclusively on the few examples of violence in order to paint all protesters as violent and therefore justifying the federal response.
Yeah. But one of the ironies of this is that by late June, when Trump signed this executive order, the George Floyd protests in Portland had diminished to such an extent that really nobody posed any threat to people or buildings by that point. The protests were kind of tapering down organically. So one of the questions I have about this whole phenomenon is why Portland and why July? You know, when the protests all over the country were already diminishing.
Well, I have a theory of that, if you'd like to hear.
Yeah, sure.
First, that Portland has been, for a while now, just sort of emblematic of a progressive city. I mean, even getting down to Portlandia as a popular pop culture thing. Democratic mayor, Democratic governors, and a state that reliably votes Democratic every single time there's a presidential election. I can't remember the last time Oregon went Republican in a presidential election. And also, and it could be a conspiracy theory, but what I've heard online is speculation that it was in July because it was starting to peter out. And if you're going to start mobilizing this as part of your presidential campaign, you want violent protesters so that you can then talk about how you are the law and order president who's going to keep people in the suburbs safe.
Yeah, that makes sense to me, and I've heard other people say that as well. You know, you'd love to believe that the motivation of the president of the United States is not so self-serving and nefarious, but that appears to be the reality of what we're living through right now.
Mm-hmm.
So now I want to hit you with some alphabet soup in this next part. Get a load of this motley crew of acronyms. This is the motley crew that was sent to Portland last month. So DHS, Department of Homeland Security, creates a task force they call the Protecting American Communities Task Force, or PACT, P-A-C-T, to
It's got to be an acronym.
Yes,
It's
of
got to be
course.
an acronym that spells something out.
Oh, and there's a bunch more coming. Get ready. So PACT is going to coordinate the federal response. And then early in July, I'm going to use a technical term now, a shitload of federal forces descend on the U.S. courthouse in Portland. And among all those federal forces are the following areas: the Federal Protective Service, and their job is just what it says, to protect federal property. So that kind of makes sense that they would be deployed to Portland. But also the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, the ATF, the folks who handle arson and bombings and are based in the Department of Justice. The U.S. Marshal Service, also in the Department of Justice. Those are the folks who apprehend fugitives around the country. Then there were tactical agents from the Customs and Border Protection Department, CBP for short. Those are the border security people. And specifically, when I say tactical agents, the special group they sent was called BORTAC, B-O-R-T-A-C, another acronym, which is basically CBP's equivalent of a SWAT team. And really, they had been used for combating drug smuggling. They were also sent to Portland, as well as the investigations unit from Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, or ICE. We all remember ICE, the folks who put immigrant kids in cages.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I heard about ICE, and I heard this a couple months ago, and it disturbed me, is that ICE's mandate, their charter, allows them to operate within 50 miles of any border, which would basically take in every single coastal city in the United States, including New York City, Boston, Seattle, Portland, Los Angeles. Those all fall under ICE's mandate because we're close enough to a border.
Yes, you're stealing some of my thunder here, son. But I thought it was 100 miles from any external boundary, but I'm going to get to that shortly, so we can bandy it around further in a few minutes. Let me just finish this alphabet soup. So we've got Federal Protective Service, we got ATF, the U.S. Marshals, CBP, and CBP's BORTAC unit. We have ICE, but we also have the Transportation Security Administration, TSA. Yes, these are the people who screen your luggage in airports. They were sent to Portland.
The people who look so bored when you're taking off your shoes going through the security. They're there in combat fatigues and gas masks in Portland.
In fact, you may have just figured out why they were sent to Portland, to live a more exciting life on the job than what they normally do. Good intuitions, Mark. Yeah.
Instead of a Starbucks card as a reward for good service, you get sent to a public demonstration in riot gear.
Yes. And even the Coast Guard was sent to Portland, plus a bunch of federal drones and helicopters. And I'm not sure I've even captured all the federal units sent, but those are the ones that I found out about in my research. So this impressive array of totally extraneous federal force was codenamed Operation Diligent Valor, set up to protect the federal buildings and reestablish law and order in the immediate area of that courthouse in Portland.
And each one of these acronym soup ingredients, there has to be a separate chain of command for all of those. And what a nightmare to try to coordinate all of those forces. Or have they just all been brought under, Secretary Wolf?
Yeah, so good question. And in researching this, I actually printed out the flow chart of the Department of Homeland Security. And so quite a lot of these departments are under the DHS banner. Only the Federal Protective Service and the ATF folks are DOJ. So it really is Department of Justice, William Barr, and Chad Wolf's DHS that are running the show here. So just in case you were wondering why the one non-local law enforcement service that's specifically trained to defuse these kinds of situations where you have to protect property and restore order to the streets, of course I'm talking about the National Guard, just in case you're wondering why they weren't summoned to Portland, I was wondering the same thing. You want to take a guess before I tell you why they did not come to Portland?
I guess my best guess would be that they would be subject to the authority of the mayor or the governor, and they wanted strictly federal authority there?
Yes, you nailed it. It's because President Trump doesn't have the authority to federalize a state's National Guard except in very limited circumstances, like literally an insurrection in the country or civil war. And as you mentioned, the Democratic mayor of Portland and the governor of Oregon were not about to call in National Guard because they didn't think Portland's peaceful protests warranted that kind of response.
Right. Well, it didn't until federal forces showed up and everyone got so much more angry.
Yes, the federal response, I think it's unquestionable that the federal response inflamed tensions, destabilized the situation. Exactly the opposite of what they intended to do. And soon after their arrival, the crowds in Portland got larger and louder, and violence ensued on both sides, usually late at night after the peaceful protesters had dispersed. If federal troops place someone under arrest in Portland, or any other city for that matter, they do have to follow the same basic requirements as state or local officials. For example, they have to tell you the grounds for your arrest. What are you being arrested for? They have to read you your Miranda rights. Anybody who's watched cop shows on TV knows what those are. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to talk to an attorney. Attorney must be present during questioning. If you can't afford a lawyer, one will be provided for you at government expense. Those are the Miranda warnings, hard fought in a Supreme Court case, and they must be read to all prisoners placed under arrest by federal authorities, or any other authority for that matter. The feds also have to make sure you get a speedy trial in front of an impartial jury. And all these things I just mentioned are requirements that stem from the Fifth Amendment to our Constitution and the Sixth Amendment to our Constitution. So in that respect, the feds are operating under exactly the same restrictions as local police. The feds are also enjoying the same privileges that local police enjoy in this arresting situation. For example, the right to search the person they've just arrested, to protect themselves, and to preserve evidence that the arrested person might try to destroy. But here's where it gets trickier. When and how federal authorities can place people under arrest depends on what crime they allege to have been committed, and federal law differs from state and local law. Federal laws also have different standards for what constitutes probable cause to make an arrest. There's a lot of gray area around the federal justification for making arrests in Portland. The feds claim they're providing additional manpower to protect federal buildings, property, and that they only arrest people who commit federal crimes. If that's true, that would be a solid legal basis for making arrests. Vandalizing federal buildings, if you spray them with graffiti or you light a fire on the premises or you throw rocks or bottles at federal agents, those are all federal crimes. So if the feds are arresting people for those reasons, then they're well within the law to do so. But the feds' justification has come under scrutiny in Portland, and As so often happens in this kind of situation, President Trump is tweeting and commenting about restoring law and order to the streets of Portland and other cities, and that undermines the federal justification that we're just protecting federal property that is offered by Chad Wolf and other officials.
Right. Not the first time that the president's tweeting has undermined a case that has been currently in the courts.
Yes, exactly. So this is something is a little counterintuitive, at least to me. If you commit mayhem on a street of a city, that's not a federal crime. It's a state or local crime. And restoring law and order to city streets is not a federal responsibility. There's a recent lawsuit brought by the Wall of Moms in Portland against all the federal officials. And in their complaint, I'm going to read you a quote from their complaint. I quote, "Defendants' actions betray a foundational principle of American democracy, that the federal government exercises only the powers the Constitution authorizes. Other powers, including the general police power, are reserved to the states and their subdivisions. The U.S. Constitution does not permit a federal domestic security or police force." End quote. So the states and their subdivisions, which of course are the cities and local police departments like Portland PD, I think that's the crux of the matter here. If there's evidence of a federal crime being committed, then the actions of the feds in Portland are lawful. But if there's no evidence of a federal crime being committed, then the actions of the feds in Portland are probably unlawful, even if there's a host of city and state crimes being committed at the same time.
And that would be the basis of the multiple lawsuits that are being brought against the deployment of these forces.
Yes, exactly. I want to bring up a few other gray areas. Here's one. Protesters have also alleged that the feds are conducting operations far away from the property they're supposedly protecting. Many legal experts think that if the feds stray too far from the site of that U.S. courthouse, I think it's called the Mark Hatfield Courthouse in downtown Portland, if they stray too far away to make arrests, those arrests are unconstitutional. But as you mentioned a few minutes ago, federal statutes actually empower CBP agents, at least, to conduct searches extending 100 air miles inland from any external boundary of the USA. And that's an area that rather conveniently encompasses about 2/3 of the U.S. population, and obviously includes many coastal cities like Portland, not to mention New York, Philadelphia, Houston, etc., Los Angeles.
It includes Chicago, too, because they're close enough to the Canada border, or do they?
Yes, that's absolutely right. It would include Chicago.
So pretty much every city of note except maybe Dallas. I'm not sure of the geography of Texas.
Right. And actually, now that I think of it, that's probably exactly why CBP is an important component of this federal force, because they do have that latitude of work within 100 miles of an external boundary. Here's some more gray area. Federal and local laws are often in tension, both in the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. In Portland, this has led to a lot of controversy and a lot of lawsuits. I'm going to give you a few examples. Example 1. The city of Portland has explicitly banned the use of tear gas, except, this is a quote, except when life or safety is at risk. But the feds have made ample use of tear gas since their arrival. Why? Because federal law doesn't ban the use of tear gas. Here's another example. Many states and localities compel their law enforcement officers to clearly identify themselves. And yet many of the feds in Portland are wearing camouflage and explicitly refusing to identify themselves. It is true that some of the CBP officers are wearing clear insignias that tell you what branch of the government they're from. Many other officers are wearing nothing more than a generic police patch, which is obviously misleading. And then a third example to offer: most people expect police vehicles to be conspicuously marked, but the feds have been spotted patrolling around Portland in unmarked cars and vans, and even detaining people in those vehicles. Now, their rationale, DHS's rationale, is that the crowds have been setting fire to police cars as part of the nationwide George Floyd protest. They want to avoid that fate. Above and beyond all that tension between local and federal laws, there are other things that I think are very dubious in terms of constitutionality that are going on in Portland. Some protesters who've been arrested are reporting being forced to sign statements barring them from attending other protests, rallies, assemblies, or public gatherings in the state of Oregon as a condition of their release from custody. Had you heard about that one? Because I had not.
I did read about that, and on the face of that, that seems like an obvious First Amendment violation. Like,
yes.
Is it even possible to sign away your First Amendment rights? Especially under what would appear to be police duress.
Right. Well, there is some debate about this, but I think it's safe to say, at least from what I've read, that the consensus is that that's clearly First Amendment right, and you don't sign that away. It's unconstitutional to ask somebody to sign that away.
Yeah, that seems clear overreaching. You almost wonder if they know it's not going to stand up in court, but it might still work out because most people, A, won't have the resources to take it to court, and B, might be frightened enough by potential consequences to violating the agreement that even if they feel like it's unconstitutional, they're still unwilling to continue protesting.
Yes, I agree. And in fact, there are people who've been arrested and had these forms forced upon them, who've said that they believed it was the only way they'd get out of lockup. So they were willing to sign it, even though it looked dodgy to them. So the lawyers are going to sort this out in court, because that's one of the many lawsuits brought against the federal government in connection with this. But interestingly, federal magistrate judges actually signed all those orders that have that language in them. So there's at least some federal legal authorities who believe that this is constitutional. So,
well, that's the benefit of being president, is that you can appoint federal judges, and some of those federal judges will be friendly to your administration.
And the last thing I want to say on this topic is, given the vast growth of federal law enforcement in recent decades, particularly since 9/11, when the DHS was created out of whole cloth, and all the militarization of law enforcement in recent years, you and I shouldn't be surprised to be thinking about this question of yours as we watch what's happening on the streets in Portland.
This does feel like an inflection point. Like, there have been trends that have been slowly building, like you say, the militarization of the police, the building out of an internal surveillance network that was spurred originally by the terrorist attacks on 9/11. And eventually, just as a country and as a people, we are going to be called on to make a decision about whether or not these are part of the society that we live in. And if they're not, then we need to show up at the polls to vote for people who will introduce appropriate legislation to rein these things in.
Yeah. And speaking of the polls, in this election year, I think the one thing we can be sure of is that this federal law enforcement show is going to be coming to a city near you. Trump seems hell-bent on expanding federal presence in major cities, especially those run by Democrats. And
he does, but it's curious that they sent forces to Seattle, and those forces turned around and left again like 2 or 3 days later, and they've announced a withdrawal from Portland. I thought I had a pretty clear sense of what the strategy was here, which would have been like intentional, blatant provocation in order to get the sort of violent response that they're looking for. And I'm having a hard time reconciling with that with the fact that they came to Seattle. They did essentially nothing while they were here, and then they announced that they were leaving. So I'm not really sure what's going on at this point.
Yeah, speaking of Seattle, there's one thing I love that your mayor, Jenny Durkin, said, because a lot of us left of center types are worried that if Trump drums up civil unrest in all these major cities, that's going to do is start the backlash against all these peaceful protests, or what used to be peaceful protests. And Jenny Durkin said something like, this is becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy in that, they send the feds into the city, they stoke these divisions and all this trouble, tumult, and then the cities react and sometimes overreact, and then Trump uses it to prove the point of why he came in the first place and cuts a few campaign commercials about it. So if there is a way for Trump to be successful, it would be in this way that Mayor Durkin identified, of kind of baiting the left into becoming unruly and unlawful in their protests.
Yeah. Well, mayors like Durkin, and I'm sure the situation is similar in Portland, Chicago, wherever else this is coming up, they're trying to maintain a really tricky balance because Durkin is basically progressive. She's not as progressive as some people in Seattle would like her to be, but she's probably pretty solidly progressive. But she's not out on the ramparts, throwing the first Molotov against the wall of the federal buildings. So she's trying to balance the sympathy for the protests against the ultimate desire to get the protesters off the street and then focus on positive legislation. And anything like the federal response that might be intended to stoke the fires and get things going even worse than before makes it much harder for mayors like her to keep the police from escalating their response to it, keeps the citizenry from just getting more and more angry. I'm sure she did not think that she was going to have such a difficult job when she first became mayor of Seattle, and I'm happy that I don't face the same challenges, because it does seem an almost impossible gap to bridge sometimes.
Right. We can only hope that somehow people keep it under control and don't explode in anger at the federal presence, because that's just playing into Trump's hands,
It's exactly what he wants. It's exactly what Fox News expects, and any footage that we provide them in terms of violent protests, they will run on repeat for as long as they can in order to inflame their viewers to get to the polls and vote for conservative candidates.
Did I answer your question?
You answered my question. You disturbed me and also reassured me a little bit. Like, I'm glad that if I'm pulled aside by federal forces, that they do need to read me my rights, that they will let me use a lawyer, and that I will not live out my days in a gulag somewhere, presumably, because there is still a rule of law in this country.
Yes.
Fingers crossed.
Well, truth be told, you probably will live out your days in a gulag, but not for that reason.
Yeah, there are many other reasons.
And that's for another podcast.
That's it for this edition of Mansplaining. Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Thank you for hanging out with us for a little bit, and we'll see you next time.